Welcome, welcome everybody. So I'll be presenting on my thesis, which I've titled Imagining a Liberated Future with Queer Ecology. So why I chose this topic was basically for the opportunity to combine LGBTQ plus studies, or queer and trans, as I'll be shortening it throughout my presentation. And combining those studies with environmental studies. It was also a very personal topic for me as a queer and trans person. I also wanted to be able to debunk claims of unnaturalness that are currently being used to promote injustice towards queer and trans people, as well as looking for different models of solving current large-scale issues. So my guiding research questions were, how can queer theory be used to deconstruct and disrupt dominant gendered perspectives and understandings of the environment or nature in order to create a more nuanced understanding of gender, sexuality, and nature, as well as asking how can queer ecology be used to enhance diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in environmental perspectives and practices, as well as aid in the creation of a more just and equitable future in the collective imagination. So what is queer ecology? So as an emerging transdisciplinary field of study, queer ecology works to bring queer theory together with ecology. The meaning of queer here is twofold in that it centers non-heterosexual and transgender organisms in ecological studies, as well as centering the perspectives of queer and trans humans. It also seeks to queer environmental perspectives by challenging dominant notions of naturalness and normality grounded in heteronormative ideas of sex, gender, and nature. So my thesis really explores the potential of queer ecology to first disrupt heterosexist and unscientific charges of unnaturalness against queer and trans identities. Secondly, it extends our understanding of the historical context in which American anti-queer and trans sentiments became institutionalized in Western science. And then lastly, it also sheds light on how queer ecology's goals of transformative justice offer new ways of collaboration, solidarity, kinship, or familial relations and care systems across and between cultures and species. So throughout my work, I explored a lot of literature that was directly related to queer ecology, as well as works that are interconnected, especially ecofeminism, critical race theory, decolonization, and emergent strategy. So to kind of just develop an understanding of the jargon I'll be using, the term heteronormativity or heterosexism is the belief or assumption that all people are heterosexual, or that heterosexuality is the default or normal state of sexual orientation. It also assumes that a gender binary of only two distinct sexes of masculine males and feminine females, and that heterosexual sex and relations are the only valid form of relationships. It also relies on gender essentialism, or sometimes referred to as biological determinism, which is the belief that a person or a particular trait is inherently and permanently male and masculine, or feminine and female. So this really confuses biological sex as the primary factor in determining gender and ignores the cultural construction of gender presentation and identity. So queer ecology really works to point out binary structures in ecological and social narratives that frame one side of traits as superior and rational and the other side as inferior and closer to nature. So this works to privilege whiteness over people of color, men over women, heterosexual over homosexual, and human culture over nature. However, within this binary structure, there's an exception of framing queer and transness as unnatural and thus having no place in nature or being seen as a mistake. So the first section in my thesis that I really covered was queering nature. And what I found out is that nature is very queer. There are very many non-human animals that engage in same-sex sex and relationships, have a large variety of family and child rearing structures outside of a nuclear family model, as well as engage in non-procreative sex or don't reproduce or have sex at all. Both plants and animals express what we consider gender outside of a binary, as well as with some species having multiple variations of expression, even when a binary exists, as well as living in bodies that combine both. So basically, our current model of categorization is really unable to accommodate for the extensive diversity that exists in the natural world. And just kind of looking at some of my favorite queer species that I came across. We see the bighorn sheep, which really defies the idea of a heterosexual masculine male, because the macho males basically live year-round in homosexual societies separately from the females, except during breeding season. And all of them engage in same-sex sex, whereas the straight males actually live among the females. They're a lot more docile, they're less aggressive towards the females, and they actually squat to pee. And then to the right of that is the spotted hyena, which really defies the idea of gender roles and bodies. All females have elongated clitoris that resembles a penis, and it's actually bigger than the males. They can actually urinate and give birth through this, and they are bigger than the males, and in their hierarchical structure, they're actually dominant over the males, with the lowest ranking female being higher ranking than the highest ranking male. And then in the bottom left corner, there are mushrooms, which really defy the ability to be neatly categorized and understood as an organism, as they're neither plant nor animal. And pictured there, I have a Schizophilum commune, which has over 23,000 sexes or mating types. And then next to that is an image of a hooded warbler with a cowbird chick. And cowbirds are actually referred to brood parasites because they'll lay their eggs in other birds' nests like hooded warblers. However, warblers can tell the difference of the eggs. They'll sometimes destroy that egg, but then other times they might choose to raise that chick. Sometimes cowbirds will lay eggs in male homosexual pairs' nests who essentially adopt and raise that chick. Other bird species like swallows will lay eggs in other swallows' nests as a means of dispersing childcare, and other bird species will actually raise their chicks communally. So there tends to be a lot of negative language used in supposedly objective scientific studies of animal behaviors that tend to not align with dominant ideas of appropriate family structures. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of sexual and gender variation among plants and non-human animals, which is to say that there's too much diversity of bodies, behaviors, and relationships just to say that one type is correct or the normal way of being. So in the next section of my thesis, I looked a lot into history, and I really focused in on the part of history of pathologizing queer and transness in the US, as well as a more nuanced history of the conservation movement. History isn't just facts, it's the stories that we tell as a means of understanding our present and potential futures. And then, although anti-queer and trans sentiments go back really far in the US due to the institutionalization of Christianity, it wasn't until the late 1880s that same-sex sexuality was actually discovered in the US and began being written about in scientific literature. So queer and trans identities at this time were seen as mental illness or disease and were deemed a threat to the stability of America. This is also a time when racial demographics and gender roles were changing and restructuring, and many wealthy, educated white men feared losing political power and essentially used the institution of science to frame queer and trans people as something gone wrong in biology or as moral degenerates. Scientists of this time also linked moral degeneracy to urbanization through the use of scientific racism, social Darwinism, and the eugenics movement. And so social Darwinism, which is now viewed as a pseudoscience, refers to the various theories that work to naturalize the concept of survival of the fittest, which argues that it's natural for the strong to see their wealth and power increase, while the weak will see their wealth and power decrease. Social Darwinists took a lot of ideas from Charles Darwin, however, they twisted his notions of evolution and natural selection to basically justify individualistic competition within capitalism alongside supporting white supremacy, nationalism, and even fascism. So these ideas really influenced the American eugenics movement, which theorized and really popularized the idea that diseases and mental disorders were solely linked to genetic inheritance and that human populations could be improved through selective breeding. Social Darwinists basically turned to eugenic law and medicine to assure that only the fit, or those that they deemed fit, were able to thrive, and that those they deemed unfit were basically eliminated. Those deemed unfit could be institutionalized, stripped of civil rights, face a lifetime imprisonment, have forced sterilization, or even be put to death. So social Darwinism at this time really also unfortunately influenced some conservationists of this era. I looked particularly at Theodore Roosevelt, who really saw conservation of natural resources and wilderness as a means of conserving the good character of middle and upper class white people, as well as the masculinity of white men. He really had this idea that he saw wilderness as untouched and pristine sanctuary away from civilization that affluent white men could visit and basically reaffirm their masculinity through conquering nature. And he also viewed men living in cities as being emasculated by this modernized lifestyle. He also held the idea that the early white settlers taming the wilderness had created an American identity of rugged individualism, and where the ideal for basically a shared and universal American national identity. So it'd be really easy to dismiss like a lot of these ideas of these individuals from over 100 years ago. However, a lot of these men are sanctified as heroes who founded the modern environmental movement and a lot of major mainstream environmental organizations. And even if their words have been forgotten, their ideas linking conservation, nationalism, and racism are still playing out. Many mainstream environmental organizations and institutions remain largely white and middle class and can create cultures that exclude people of color, queer and trans people, women, differently abled people, lower class or more impoverished people, and or immigrants from feeling that they can actually participate in environmentalism. So if we want to see change and make environmentalism more inclusive, critically engaging with some of these hard histories is a really great place to start. So the last section of my thesis looked at transformation, which is kind of the end goal of queer ecology. And I really looked at the framework of emergent strategy as it tries to engage in tactics in which social justice movements can learn from the ways that creatures and ecosystems function together in and within the natural world. So this transformative framework really asks us to reimagine different life forms as teachers. So say, for example, what can we learn from dandelions about resilience, or from mushrooms about interconnectedness and remediation, or from ants about cooperative work, or even looking at bird migration and learning about collective leadership and adaptability. So much like the end goal of queer ecology, the framework of emergent strategy is intended to strengthen our imaginations, both individually and collectively. Imagination is really crucial for creating change because we must first be able to imagine alternative systems and relationships if we're going to be able to create them. So basically in my thesis, I proposed that queer ecology really offers LGBTQ plus identities empowerment through the exploration of queerness and transness among non-human species, as well as offering everyone else basically possibilities and expanding our ability to imagine individually and collectively together other potentials for our present and futures. Queer ecology is really crucial for creating alternative models for humans to exist in the world, as well as for organizing together in order to address large-scale issues such as climate change that threaten life in all its expressions. So some kind of quick points of what I thought of as some next steps. I really believe that teaching queer ecology and teaching beyond basic biology as a heteronormative narrative would be a really great first step to take for education institutions. Continuing building more inclusive environmental advocacy and learning spaces. There's already organizations that are taking this approach, like Latino Outdoors, Outdoor Afro, Native Women's Wilderness, or even Queer Eco Justice Project, just to name a handful. I feel like we really need to start leaning into and learning hard histories to try and process some of these ideas that we hold today that we don't really understand fully where they came from and some of the intentions behind them. Additionally, I think looking to nature and other human cultures for alternative models is a really great step in creation of different ideas for potential futures. Queer and trans people have created many new identities, which really can also position queer and trans scientists in a unique place to be capable of understanding the vast variety and variation of nature that a heteronormative model just simply cannot. So I know I kind of, that was a bit of a speed run through a lot of nuance, but I wanted to open the space up for any questions.